So we added navigation in the last section. Now I want to work on this list of recipe. Right now, if we have a look at its component here, we see that the code for a single list item is this one here. We do have a separate recipe item component, but right now it doesn't hold any template because we had to outsource this code and put it into this recipe list component temporarily, because otherwise we would not have been able to display our recipe data. Now we know how to pass data to a component though, so we can cut all that code here and put it into the recipe item component template. Now the goal, of course, is to get this ng for loop here and remove it from inside the item and move it back on the item here, and then pass down the individual item, the individual recipe of each iteration to that component so that we can still output recipe name and so on here. So that is your chance to do this on your own again. Pause the video and try to loop through the component itself. So get ng4 out of this component and then pass down the selected recipe or the recipe of the current loop iteration. In a few seconds, you'll see my solution. So were you successful? First of all, I'll cut the ng4 loop here and I'll go back to the recipe list component and add it to the app recipe item selector so that now the whole component is replicated for each recipe. Now the issue, of course, is that we don't have the recipe, which we access, inside the recipe item component anymore. So we should probably add a recipe here, the recipe of that single recipe item component. It will be of type recipe, of course, so we have to import this from our own recipe model, going up 2 folders, and then it's there, right in the folder we, then moved to. And initially this will not be defined. There won't be a value assigned to it, because I want to get this recipe from outside. So to get a recipe from outside, or any data from outside, we need to add something. A decorator. Add input with parentheses, which needs to be imported from @AngularCore. Add input allows us to bind this component property from outside. And of course, I want to bind it from my recipe list component here. So in this list where I replicate the single recipe item a couple of times. Now here, we can now bind to our recipe, referring to the property in the single recipe item, and bind the recipe of the current loop iteration. Now, I'm not happy with the naming here because that can be very confusing. We're having recipe 3 times here. So to make super clear what each name here refers to, I'll rename the recipe here in our loop to recipe L for element, and that also has to be replaced here then, because we're passing the single recipe element as a value, therefore on the right side of the equal sign, to the bindable recipe property. And keep in mind, the recipe here between the squared brackets simply is the recipe property in the component we're placing this on. So in the recipe item component, this recipe here. That is what that refers to. And actually, to make this super clear, I can split this horizontally to have the receiving component, the recipe item component, and the sending one, here template of the sending one, the recipe list component above each other. So that is what we're binding to here. So let me close this. With this, if we save that, we should see the same as before, which makes sense. It's a good thing that we see this. It means it didn't break. And it makes sense because now we're successfully passing down the data, which, keep in mind, is stored in the recipe list component here in this array. We're successfully passing this down to the recipe item component. Now let's work on the feature that once we click an item here, we actually select it and then we load it in the recipe detail component. So that is what we'll work on next.